Ever wish that you could somehow just shake your drawings up a little, make them look a bit different, feel like stylistically they're a bit the same, in a bit of a rut, and yet no matter how hard you try, they still end up looking very much the same? Let me give you 5 ways that you can instantly, and not just instantly, but very easily shake up how your drawings look. Because these 5 very easy things to do will shake up your drawing process, because how our drawings look is as much a part of our drawing process as our skills, as our techniques, and of the deliberate technical styles we're trying to use when we draw. If we change the fundamental elements of our drawing process, it can't help but have an impact in some way, and in many ways in what will seem like an effortless way, on our drawings. And then we can decide whether we like those impacts or not, whether these give us an indication of ways we could more deliberately choose to change to develop how we draw. So the first way we can really easily shake up the way we draw, and therefore the way our drawings look, is to change the size of our reference that we use to draw from. And it doesn't matter whether we draw from a hard copy that we print off, whether it's from a screen that we look at, an iPad or a desktop. I'm not talking about cropping, I'm not talking about changing the image, I'm talking about changing the size of the image that we're looking at. Whether what I'm looking at is this size or this size, same image, different sizes. Because what I look at, the size of it, determines what I'm looking at and how I see it, even when it's exactly the same in every respect. Because when something is smaller, I can see more of it more easily, and yet the detail is less. So my focus is on other parts. My focus is often more of an overall view. The way perhaps I perceive values is different. The way edges look can be different, as opposed to looking at a larger size, where perhaps I don't take in the whole scene in one go, and therefore my eyes roam around more. And when I draw, that may mean that I roam around in my drawing rather than perhaps seeing an overall view all at once and perhaps getting an overall focus. Now, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. What I'm saying is our perception, what we see, is impacted by the size we look at, and therefore the process of viewing, of perceiving that we follow. These things impact how we draw and what we draw. And because our reference is our starting point, if we change our starting point of our drawing process, then we're going to have an impact at the end of our drawing process. In fact, it could well be an impact that ripples through and magnifies throughout the whole drawing session. And I'm not particularly saying draw larger or draw smaller. I'm saying change the size of what we're looking at, both at the start of our drawing and throughout the drawing process. But my second way we can shake up our drawing process and affect the way our drawings look is to change the size of our drawing. I'm not talking of changing the size of the paper, but the actual size of where the ink goes on the paper. If we normally make that, say, half a copy paper size, then make it a full copy paper size. Make it half as much again. Make it 2/3 of the size. Because the truth is, probably most of us, most of the time, tend to draw the same size of drawing. Now, that may be for as simple a reason as the fact that we have a drawing book and the pages are a certain size, and we like to leave a certain border of white around, or we draw to the edges, whatever. It's not what we do, it's the fact that we tend to do the same thing all the time. Changing the size of that is an easy way we can shake up our drawing process to force us to do things in a different way, because what works, the techniques that we then use to actually create our drawings, what works for one size don't always work as easily or as naturally for another size. And so it forces us to experiment and in some way make the sorts of changes that perhaps we've been unable to make more deliberately, keeping all of these things the same. It's not that larger is better than smaller. It's changing the way we normally draw. The third way to shake up our drawing style, the way our drawings look, is to change the time we spend drawing. It doesn't matter, again, what the length of time we normally draw is, and this obviously will be different for each of us. But if I normally finish a drawing in a 20-minute session, then maybe a 30 or a 40-minute drawing session would be a good shake-up, a good way to stimulate me thinking and processing and putting marks and lines on the paper in different ways. If I normally do a drawing in 3 one-hour sessions for the one drawing, then perhaps trying to finish a drawing in a 1-hour session, and probably for maximum effect, to try and do the same sort of drawing in this shorter time. A little time pressure really can stop us from becoming overly precious, overly exact, can loosen up our mark making, our line making, and often this produces a more animated, a more lively, a more interesting looking drawing. Now, if we think back to the earlier 2 points, changing the size of the reference that we use or changing the size of the drawing that we're doing will probably impact the time we spend drawing anyway. It's unlikely that we're going to take the same time to do something where we've changed one of the parameters as significantly as I'm suggesting that you might. I'm not really suggesting that if we do a drawing half the size, that we do it in half the time, and that's what I'm talking about. Rather, I'm suggesting more, don't just change the size, but change the speed with which we draw. Go with a faster tempo where we're having to make decisions and make commitments faster, or equally going a bit slower and spending more time navigating some of the options in our drawing. I'm talking about consciously changing whatever the natural tempo of our drawing that we have, because that will change the way our drawings look. If the tempo of our drawing stays the same, it's going to be harder, even if we make the other changes that I'm talking about in these 5 points. It's going to be harder for those to have the real impact that they could otherwise have on how our drawings look at the end. And when I talk about changing the tempo, I'm never talking about rushing. Whatever marks, whatever lines, whatever we're splashing, putting, scratching, dragging onto our paper, we always want to feel that we're still in control of it. A fourth way I want to suggest we can easily change the way our drawings look is to change the pen we use. Now, we could change the pen type, the brand, but not just the brand, but also the way the nib is formed, the way the ink flows from the pen onto the paper. But I'm particularly thinking of changing the pen size, as in the width of the line, whether it's a 0.05 or a 0.5 millimeter fine liner. Again, probably because we buy certain pens and then we use them. So we tend to be using the same pens all the time. And the pen, the line, fairly unconsciously, I think, drives for most of us a lot of the technique decisions that we make, because the width of the line does obviously impact the way our drawing looks. The same size drawing with a wider line is going to overall have a blacker feel, because the relative amount of ink on the paper for the size of the drawing, if we drew the drawings the same size, is going to be greater. This also means that when we draw lines very closely together, if we're trying to keep the same proportions in place, the, if you like, white gap between those two lines is going to appear thinner than if we're using a thinner black line on each side. The amount of detail we're able to draw without what we're drawing becoming basically a blob of black ink is obviously less the thicker the line we're drawing with. What tends to happen is I get practiced, I become experienced in making a lot of decisions unconsciously as to what I can draw and how I can draw it based on the result that a certain pen width will give me. And this, of course, all flows to a consistency in how my drawings look. By changing the width of my line, it makes my drawings look different, and at the very least subconsciously, but probably to some degree consciously, this is going to drive me to do things a bit differently. Whether it's adding more lines, or whether it's drawing more detail, or some other possibility that suddenly becomes apparent because my drawing is looking different through its progress than it normally does. Other things we could try related to this is using various line thicknesses in the one drawing if this is not something we normally do. Remember, it's about making changes with the process of our drawing. Or we could try using various grayscales of ink in various pens in the one drawing, again, if this is something we don't normally do. All of these things are changes we're introducing that, in a sense, happen before we start to put any marks on the paper, before any ink hits the paper. And to a greater or more subtle degree, they change our drawing process enough that we can't sit in the same groove that we normally sit in when we draw. And as we respond to this, our drawings start to, in some way, look different. And the fifth way we can shake up how our drawings look by changing our drawing process is to change the amount of detail that we plan to draw. Again, this is the sort of way of thinking we end up developing as we draw drawing after drawing that tends to become the same, tends to become consistent, and becomes, I think, a significant contributor to how our drawing looks. Now, it's not just that if a drawing has a lot more detail in it than a drawing that has less detail in it, it looks different. It may look cluttered, it may look more realistic, it may look more interesting. Or it may be that in going after all that detail, we actually push beyond a level of expertise that we've actually developed yet to be able to draw it well. But whatever it is, we tend to get into a pattern. We tend to go with drawing the same amount of detail when we look at the same subject on the same scale. And as I reflected earlier, the 4 points we've already talked about will have an impact on this anyway. If my reference photo is larger, I will see more detail more easily, which will make it easier for me to include that detail, though it will also make it harder for me to deliberately simplify that detail because now there's an extra step I have to take. And this can make a big difference whether we're drawing an ornate building or whether we're drawing a tree. Again, if I change the size of my drawing, then a larger drawing makes it easier to, in some ways, include more detail. Of course, it may make it easier to include too much detail. A smaller scale drawing will force me to simplify, even if I can see the detail in the reference. If I change my drawing time, then I probably won't have time to possibly draw all the detail that I would normally draw. So I'm forced to simplify, or I'm forced to change the way I visualize, the way I picture the detail, and the way I draw it. And of course, if I change my pen width, if I make it a thicker line or a thinner line, then that will cause the detail I draw to both look different, but also it will open up or remove possibilities of drawing as much detail as I might have otherwise done in my normal drawing habit. But again, let me suggest not just changing the amount of detail we draw as a flow-on effect from some of these other points, but to actually consciously choose to draw more detail or draw less detail, and possibly make some of the other changes to accommodate that. So maybe I will choose to take a bit longer time than I normally do, to draw a bit larger than I normally would, to use a thinner line than I normally would, to make it easier to include more detail and see how that goes. Or if I don't like the way my drawings look and I do a lot of detail, then possibly it would benefit my drawing process and results to draw faster, smaller, using a smaller reference so that I can't see the detail as easily in the first place and be tempted to draw it, to help me see the detail in a new way by seeing less of it. Can also help me to find new marks to represent it in a simplified way. Or I might leave things out that I would have tried to draw in the past. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, if you'd like to shake up your drawings, then these are 5 very quick, instant ways that we don't have to do any preparation for, except decide to do it this way and see how it looks. And if we don't like the changes, if we don't find them interesting, if we don't find them helpful in presenting new possibilities for our drawings to us, then obviously we can go back to how we've done things. But in my experience, when I've changed these parameters for one reason or another, quite often in response to having to make all these YouTube videos, I've been surprised at how much I've learned. And not just how much I've learned, but how much it's kept my interest in drawing going. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, whatever parameters you use or don't use, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.